Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this very special seminar on Tamil Muslims and Malay publishing, jointly organized by Budhi, the Malay Heritage Center and the Center for Singapore Tamil Culture. I should also mention that this seminar is part of a series titled Shaping Cultures and Minds in Early Singapore. This series is co-created by the Malay Heritage Center and Budhi. Though we had very much wanted this to be a hybrid event, whereby some of you would be here at the Malay Heritage Center with us while the rest would participate online, most unfortunately, we have had to cancel live participation owing to COVID conditions. But we thank each and every one of you for joining us online, especially during these trying times. I'm Jayasudha Samuthiran from the Center for Singapore Tamil Culture, CSTC for short. And I'll be your MC for today. This is going to be a 2-hour program with mostly spoken words. But the Malay Heritage Center has gone to special efforts to present a musical program to start this afternoon. More on that in just a moment. We have the leaders of the 3 co-organizing institutions to say a few words of introduction. I'll introduce them individually. Then we have the panel discussion with our 2 main speakers who will be introduced by the moderator. That, in a nutshell, is the program for today. The first item is the musical performance by Tasneem. Tasneem was established in 2004 as a nasheed group. Now, what is nasheed? Nasheed means chants in Arabic. It is a work of vocal music that is either sung as an a cappella with instruments according to a particular style or tradition within Islam. Nasheeds are popular throughout the Islamic world. The material and lyrics of a nasheed usually make reference to Islamic beliefs, history, and religion, as well as current events. So we've got Tasneem, which was established in 2004 as a nasheed group. From a humble start with 5 members, today they are now a group of 48 members in total, performing at various functions. In 2020, they represented Singapore in the Anugerah Nasheed Malaysia, Malaysian Nasheed Award, under the Nusantara category. Let's give it up for Tasneem.
Thank you so much for the introduction. We would like to thank the organizers for inviting us to this humble event. Without further ado, again, we would like to introduce ourselves. We have right here with us, we have got 5 members of our group, which consists of different instruments, especially to put in a bit of an Indian touch. We have tabla player, which is Faz. We have got Amirul Rifdi, who is playing the cajon today. We've got Hafiz Alwi, who is our toys instrument player, and also myself, who's going to play the guitar and sing, as well as our main lead singer, Naufal. So without delaying, we'll be playing our first piece, which is called Allahi Allah Kia Karo by Mahirzin. We hope you enjoy yourself.
Allahi Allah kiya karo, dukh na kisi ko diya karo, jo duniya ka malik hai, naam usi ka liya karo. Allahi Allah, Allah kiya karo, dukh na kisi ko diya karo, jo duniya ka malik hai, naam usi ka liya karo. Just like the sunrise can't be denied, oh, just like the river will find the sea. Oh Allah, you're here and you're always near, and I know without a doubt that you'll always hear my prayer. Sach ki raah pe chala karo, dukh na kisi ko diya karo, jo duniya ka malik hai, naam usi ka liya karo. Allahi Allah, Allahi Allah, Allahi Allah hiya karo, किसी को दिया करो जो दुनिया का मालिक है नाम उसी का लिया करो अल्लाह ही अल्लाह अल्लाह ही अल्लाह So many bright stars diamonds in the sky oh it makes me wonder anyone can be blind to all the signs so clear just open your eyes and I know without a doubt you will surely see the light तेरी ही दुनिया तेरी ज़मीन ये का शाहिद दूहे करीम मेरे मौला सुन ले दुआ हमने बस है तेरे बिना रोशन कर जहां ऐसा जुल्म न किया करो दुख न किसी को दिया करो जो दुनिया का मालिक है नाम उसी का लिया करो अल्लाह ही अल्लाह अल्लाह ही अल्लाह अल्लाह ही अल्लाह हिया करो दुख न किसी को दिया करो जो दुनिया का मालिक है नाम उसी का लिया करो अल्लाह ही अल्लाह अल्लाह ही अल्लाह अल्लाह ही अल्लाह हिया करो दुख न किसी को दिया करो जो दुनिया का मालिक है नाम उसी का लिया करो अल्लाह ही अल्लाह अल्लाह ही अल्लाह
Thank you. And the next piece that we will be singing will be a song called Allahu. It is just going to be explaining or it will be describing the greatness of the Creator. So we hope you enjoy yourself.
Allahu 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 ये ज़मीन जब न थे जहाँ जब न था ये ज़मीन जब न थे जहाँ जब न था चांद सूरज न थे आसमान जब न था चांद सूरज न थे आसमान जब न था राज़ी हक बे किसी पर आया जब न था तब न था कुछ यहाँ तब न था कुछ यहाँ हम अगर तू भी तू अल्लाहु 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 Jika tiada bumi tiada segalanya Jika tiada bumi tiada segalanya Hai bulan matahari langit pun tiada Bulan matahari langit pun tiada Tiada siapa pun tahu rahsia keagungannya Tiada siapa pun tahu rahsia keagungannya Tiada yang wujud Tiada yang wujud melainkan engkau Allahu 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 ilaha teri shaniya wahdahu, la ilaha teri shaniya wahdahu. Tu khayalo tajassus tu hi arzu, tu khayalo tajassus tu hi arzu. आँख की रोशनी दिल की आवाज़ तू, दिल की आवाज़ तभी तू है भी तू, तभी तू है भी तू, कभी तू भी तू। अल्लाहू 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 Allahu, 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 Allahu. Allahu, 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 Allahu. Tiadalah Tuhan Maha Suci yang satu, Kau dalam ingatan, Kaulah impianku, Kau permata hatiku, Kaulah suara hatiku. Kau wujud dan esa, Kau wujud dan esa, kekal selamanya. Allahu, 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 Allahu,
Wonderful performance was by Tasneem, a well-known Malay musical group in Singapore and abroad. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Jamal Mohammed, Senior Manager for Programs at the Malay Heritage Centre, to say a few words of welcome.
Thank you, Sutha. Good afternoon, Professor Yaakob Ibrahim, Advisor, Office of the President, Singapore Institute of Technology, Mr. Arun Mahinan, Director, Center for Singapore Tamil Culture, Mr. Zahidi Abdul Rahman, Director of Budhi, ladies and gentlemen watching at home. Welcome to this first edition of the Intercultural Seminar Series, Shaping Cultures and Minds in Early Singapore, jointly organized by the Malay Heritage Centre, Budhi, and the Center for Singapore Tamil Culture. The Intercultural Seminar Series came about from conversations that I myself had with today's moderator, Imran, in conceptualizing a program for Racial Harmony Day. MHC was keen to identify a suitable partner to offer in-depth programs in the form of talks, seminars, or workshops that would critically unpack and discuss Singapore's multiculturalism. While MHC's primary role is to promote and preserve Singapore's Malay heritage, we are also conscious of the intermixing and sharing that took place between communities in early Singapore. So when Imran mentioned a possible seminar in collaboration with CSTC on the role of Tamil Muslims in the Malay publishing houses, I said yes immediately. You see, most Malay publishing houses in Singapore were once located around Kampong Gelam, where Malay Heritage Centre now stands. In fact, in 2016, the Malay Heritage Centre presented an exhibition on the Malay publishing houses entitled Mereka Utusan, Imprinting Malay Modernity. The exhibition presented insights into the development of Malay modernity and identity through language of advertisements and editorial cartoons produced during the 1920s through to the 1960s. Through these features, Malay modernity and identity was simultaneously imagined and discussed in colonial Malaya and Singapore amidst important historical developments in the 20th century. The 1920s witnessed the growth of Malay publishing houses throughout the Strait Settlement. While the history of Malay printing is intertwined with the production of religious texts, or kitab, the 20th century saw publishing play a more central role in politics, commerce, and entertainment within the Strait Settlement and the Malay Peninsula. This is perhaps most evident in the field of politics, where newspapers and magazines gained momentum from various nationalist movements in the 1920s and invigorated Malay communities through widespread coverage and commentary on these events. So, today, we have with us Professor Thorsten from Freie Universität Berlin and Dr. Azhar Ibrahim from Department of Malay Studies and US to share with us their research on the role Tamil Muslims had in the development of Malay publishing. Thank you both for being with us today, and I look forward to hearing both your presentations and following discussions. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Imran Taib from Budhi and Mr. Arun from CSTC for making today's seminar possible. I hope that today's seminar will be the first of many collaborations that we'll have in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Jamal Mohammed. Next, I would like to call on Mr. Zahidi bin Abdul Rahman, Chairman of Budhi, to speak on behalf of Budhi, the principal organizer behind today's event.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I've just been told that the Tamil will not have good afternoon. Instead, they have Vanakkam, which covers everything. So time is different from each culture. Thank you, and we are happy that Budhi can collaborate with Malay Heritage Center as well as for Center for Tamil Studies to start this intercultural series. And I think it is very important, and it is more important for minority members of our society. I think we cannot ignore the relationship between the content, the skilled craftsmen, the technology, the economics, and probably the entertainment methods in how each of these factors affect the other in producing an outcome that is more than the sum of its parts in shaping our thinking, our behavior, and our cultural mores. As an architect, I like to share 3 examples from my field. Everyone knows about Rumah Melaka. It has become an archetype. That means we can describe it, and we can describe it fully, and everyone knows that it's Rumah Melaka. First and foremost of Rumah Melaka is a sweeping stone staircase with Chinese porcelain tiles. Then architecturally, it has a very frontal image or frontal aspect of the building, similar to the Minang house, as well as the asymmetrical and the assembly of the Malay house, a merger of 3 cultures. And recently in Singapore, in the 1980s, if you look at Futura apartment in Orchard Road, an iconic building with a unique shape, bow-shaped living room. The formwork of this unique structure is made by boat builders. And most likely, the boat builders come from Terengganu. And from then onwards, architecture in Singapore has changed. It is no more about straight and right angle. It provides us opportunity to be different from what we were before. And of course, if you talk about curves and incredible shapes, we must talk about Bilbao Museum. It's by Frank Gehry, and it can only happen in this century because of the use of software and computer-aided designs from the aerospace industries. There's cross-culture, there's cross-technology, and cross-expertise. Moving forward, I think it is very important for us to be aware and understand the relationship in this, through these factors. One of the things that is coming on board and coming very strongly is artificial intelligence. It has now become part and parcel of our life and soon will be embedded in all aspects of our life. These learning algorithms will affect how we interact, how we communicate, who will be employed, who will get allocated resources, and how decisions are made. Hopefully this series of intercultural seminars can start a conversation towards understanding this constant dynamic relationship. For some of us, the minority, either demographic minority, economic and business minority, technology and digital minority, and skill sets minority, it is very important that we become part of the equation rather than feeling the effect of the product of the synthesis of these factors. Thank you very much.
Next, I would like to invite Mr. Arun Mahirnan, Director of the Center for Singapore Tamil Culture, which is a co-organizer of this event.
Thank you, Sudha. Dear brothers and sisters here and those online, Selamat Petang, good afternoon, Vanakkam. Today's topic is historical, but also this event is historical for us in the Center for Singapore Tamil Culture because this is the first time that we are collaborating with Budhi as well as Malay Heritage Center. And CSTC was set up 2 years ago with the main objective of building bridges across Singapore cultures and to help enhance the understanding between cultures. We acknowledge that there are and there will be differences, but CSTC wants to go beyond tolerance. We want to go to the level of appreciation and, if possible, embrace. And I think when we begin to understand the differences, then we are taking the first step towards appreciation. So in that sense, today's topic, though it is historical and it goes back nearly 200 years, what you can say is one community that is so traditional in one language, helping and collaborating with another language community here and has eventually co-created a wonderful publishing tradition. So we see this as the way that was and the way that will be. So we are really honored. We are honored that both MHC and the Budhi organization has embraced us. It is a long journey, and we hope to cross many milestones. So we want to thank you for giving us this opportunity, and I hope all of you who are watching from wherever you are will also join us each step of this long journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arun Mahirnan. Now I would like to hand over the stage to Mr. Muhammad Imran Taib, who is the director of Budhi, and he will also introduce the two main speakers for today's discussion and then moderate today's discussion.
Thank you, Sudha. To all our viewers, welcome to today's intercultural seminar. I would say that it's quite a historic event in the sense that we are talking not just about one culture, but actually the intersection between two cultures in an intercultural manner. And that is something that is uniquely Singapore, and that has been present in Singapore's history for very long, and I think it's good that we start talking about it and we start to explore a bit more of these intercultural aspects that has shaped Singapore to what it is today. And of course, the topic today is shaping cultures and minds in early Singapore, Tamil Muslims and the Malay publishing houses. And what's more important is that we are located here in the Malay Heritage Center at the hub of the publishing houses of the Malay community, not just in Singapore, but for the region, particularly in the early 20th century. As we know, early Singapore was marked by rapid economic enterprises by different communities that has contributed to the multicultural life. And despite the enclaves of ethnic settlements under the Raffles Town Plan of 1828, there were a lot more intercultural engagements among communities along the Singapore River, if you look from the Telok Ayer and stretching to the Kallang River. And of course, the Kampong Gelam area, where we are located right now, was particularly interesting. Besides being an economic node in early Singapore, it was also the intellectual hub of the Malays. So there's always been this connection between the printing presses and the development of Malay intellectual life in early Singapore history. And publishing houses played a significant role in the transmission of ideas and knowledge for the region too. So Singapore was actually quite well placed in the past and had been an important component in the transmission of ideas in the region. What is less known, however, is the contributions of Tamil Muslims in the literary translation and publishing scene. And that's why we are having this dialogue, this intercultural dialogue today, to bring these two aspects of Singapore's history in conversation with each other. And this seminar will discuss, therefore, the interactions between Tamil Muslim literati and the Malay publishing houses in the Kampong Gelam area in particular. Now, before we start and before I introduce the speakers, some housekeeping rules. For those of you who are watching us live online, there is a QR code on your screen, and do submit your questions and comments via this QR code at any time during the presentation. All right, let me just now introduce the speakers. And the first speaker that we have today with us is Dr. Thorsten Tescher, who has long been involved in researching Tamil Muslims in Singapore. Hello, Dr. Thorsten. And he's speaking right now from Berlin. I'm wondering what's the time there now, Dr. Thorsten?
Yeah, it's actually to all the greetings. Let me add a Guten Morgen from Berlin. It's now 8:30 in the morning, so not too early.
I hope you had your breakfast, Doctor.
No, not yet.
Not yet, okay.
That will come after.
Yeah. Dr. Thorsten is currently associated with the Berlin Graduate School Muslim Cultures and Societies. His research focuses on the history and textual traditions of Tamil-speaking Muslim societies in South India, Sri Lanka, Singapore, and Malaysia. He's the author of the book Race, Religion, and the Indian Muslim Predicament in Singapore, and he has co-edited a collection entitled Non-Shia Practices of Muharram in South Asia and the Diaspora Beyond Mourning. He has also published an essay on Singapore Tamil Muslims and book Sojourners to Settlers, Tamils in Singapore. So a very well-known expert on Tamil Muslims here in Singapore. And without further ado, Dr. Thorsten, it's over to you to do your presentation.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me also thank the organizers, Budhi, the Center for Singapore Tamil Culture, and the Malay Heritage Center for having me. Thanks to Tasneem also for introducing this session so nicely. Yes, when we talk about the question of Tamil Muslims and the Malay publishing houses, let me first start with really an observation which I think is very important, that when we speak about Singapore's colonial history, and we try to move out from this focus that in the past has dominated the writing of Singapore history, that looks predominantly at the colonial power, at the English language sources, there are two aspects really that we have to bear in mind. One is there's been a tendency, even as historians have begun to unravel in greater detail the histories of the various non-European Asian communities in Singapore, to still remain within the sort of boundaries of race, to assume that when we look at the past, there is a Malay past, there's a Chinese past, there is an Indian past. And partly this is also due to linguistic skills. That is, most people will maybe be fluent in one of the important languages of these communities, but not in the others. So when we actually look at that period, we see there's a lot of crossover between different groups. And there's a lot of unexpected things that we hadn't thought that might be there. And I think this is still an ongoing project of discovery, and looking at Tamil Muslims in the Malay publishing houses is really one of these fields where there is still a lot to discover. Now, the role that printers and newspaper editors with at least partial Indian roots had in the development of Malay printing is something that has long been recognized by the historians of the Malay printing industry. And this is a process that actually goes way back into before the 1920s, actually, into the period of the 1870s, 1880s. And indeed, what I will be focusing on in my presentation today is that very early period of interaction between Indian printers and publishers on the one side and the Malay printing industry, and the development of something like Malay publishing houses really in the late 19th century. So this has long been recognized, but it is a feature of the Malay publishing world that is particularly visible in cities like Penang and Singapore, where you, of course, have a fairly large Indian Muslim community. And I will be focusing here specifically on two printing presses or publishers in Singapore in the late 19th century in my remarks. And that is, on the one side, an establishment known as Dinodaya Press, which was probably founded around 1873. I will speak a little bit more about it later, and operated until at least 1915 by a man called Singapore Ghulam Muhyiddin Makhdoom Sahib, who I will introduce to you in greater detail a little bit later. And on the other side, this is the so-called Saidi Press, or the Jawi Peranakan Press. You have both names, Jawi Peranakan Press because of the newspaper this press published, the Saidi Press because of the owner, Muhammad Said, a gentleman from Penang, which was founded around 1876 or 1877 and operated way into the 1890s, and was really the first press to publish something like a regular Malay newspaper in the Straits Settlements and Malaya world. Now, before we look in greater detail at these printers and publishers, we should first take a step back a little bit and look at the kind of social and community background these printers came from. Most of these printers that were active both on the Tamil side of printing and publishing and on the Malay side of printing and publishing were people whom we might want to describe as Straits-born Indians. The terms used in those days were either Jawi Peranakan or actually very frequent also Peranakan Kling. My apologies for using the Kling word. But that was the common name given to these people in those days. And this community of locally born Indians, Indians who often had an Indian father and a Malay mother, was really quite decisive in being able to harness both the, so to say, Tamil Indian side of their heritage and the Malay side of their heritage to bring the two together in the creation of a publishing industry. And the first individual I would like to mention here, even though he is strictly speaking not really yet a person deeply implicated in publishing or printing, is the famous Munshi Abdullah, who comes from precisely such a Peranakan sort of background in Malacca, also reflects a lot on what that heritage meant for him. When you read his autobiography, the Hikayat Abdullah, you find a lot of information on how he had to learn Tamil as a young boy, how his father and his family were situated within the wider networks of Malacca, and the whole sort of social background of these part Indian, part Malay communities along the Strait settlements. And interestingly enough, the two publishers whom I've just mentioned in the last slide, Muhammad Saeed and Makhdoom Sahib, both come from the precise same sort of background. That is, Muhammad Saeed was born in Penang, but obviously had an Indian heritage. With Makhdoom Sahib, we're not 100% sure. I am 100% sure that he was born in Singapore, but there are some people who are very passionately disputing this. So this is still an ongoing question, but his father definitely was from India. We know he was from a small town of Purayar, north of Karaikal in the Kaveri Delta. And so all these people were from this particular sort of background. They were Indians. They had long lived in the Strait settlements, if not born there actually. In the case both of Muhammad Saeed and Makhdoom Sahib, we can surmise that probably their mothers were Malay. So this is the kind of background these publishers, these early publishers, came from. Now that, of course, is a very important thing because it gives them the capacity to act both in Malay and in Indian social contexts. That is precisely the kind of skill, or one of the central skills, that helps them later on when they build their publishing business. Now, there's one last thing I would like to, one last comment I would like to make with regard to this group, this Straits-born Indians, or Jawi Peranakan. The interesting thing is that this group is often recognized as a sort of somewhat separate ethnic group within the history of colonial Singapore and Penang. But interestingly enough, the recognition of the Jawi Peranakan as a separate group is there in Malay. It is there in English, but it is not there in Tamil. That means the same individual talking to a Malay audience may identify as Jawi Peranakan, say something like, saya Jawi Peranakan, saya seorang Jawi Peranakan. But when they talk Tamil, they would probably say something simply like, nama Islam, we are Muslims, right? You don't have that term for this specific social location in the Tamil language. And that's already a very interesting sort of element of social history that the Tamil side simply recognizes these individuals as Tamils, whereas on the Malay side, they have this very peculiar location that is signaled by the term Jawi Peranakan. So let me tell you something very briefly about the Dinodaya press, which is really the press that I have been working on most intensely in my career of these various printing businesses. So this was, as mentioned, founded and operated by Singapore Makhdoom Sahib, who is the son of Puraya Ghulam Muhyiddin. That is the town, so to say, associated with the person is always given first in the Tamil tradition. As I mentioned, it was founded around 1873, actually in a sort of joint venture with the man who published the first collection of Tamil poetry in Singapore. A man called Nagor Muhammad Pulavar, if I'm not mistaken currently. My memory serves me right. It was probably founded around 1873. But we don't really have publications of the press from that time. The first book we possess, and that's already a very interesting thing, the first book we know about was a Malay Tamil vocabulary. So precisely the kind of publication that a printing press located at the boundaries of the Tamil and the Malay communities might produce, which was made in 1875. And then you have a list of both Tamil and Malay publications that we are aware of that were printed by this press. Now, the Tamil publications that Dinodaya Press printed were mostly collections of what you might call devotional poetry, both Muslim as well as Hindu devotional poetry. And then Dinodaya Press is very important on the Tamil side of things for publishing the first Tamil newspapers in Singapore. Starting in 1875, then they make a fresh attempt in 1882. And in 1887, they begin publishing Singai Nesan, which was a weekly newspaper, and that operates for 3 years. So this is really the first important Tamil newspaper in Singapore that is published by Dinodaya Press. On the other side, the Malay spectrum is a little bit wider, I would say, actually. So you have, on the one side, very traditional sort of publications like Hikayats. You have a couple of publications that are connected to the Baba, to the Chinese Peranakan community, such as Banwalao and the Syair dan Pantun Melayu in 1890 are both, in a sense, Baba publications. There is a translation of Wayang Parsi, which I find very interesting. So the Parsi theater was a little bit the 19th century's Bollywood. This was a tradition that had started in India, in Western India and Bombay, by the Parsi community. And that by the late 19th century had swept not only across India, but into Southeast Asia as well. So books connected to Parsi theater were published by Dinodaya Press. And then we have publications yet again, like dictionaries and even the official rules of the Football Association in 1909. So a mixed bag of publications. Now, there are two things which are noteworthy when we look at Dinodaya Press's output. One thing is, if you look at the dates of the publications, you come to realize that most of the early publications of Dinodaya Press were Tamil until about 1893. And after 1893, we are not aware of any Tamil publication by this press. Whereas the Malay publications tend to be a little bit later. They start in 1880, really, apart from this vocabulary, and they continue at least until the early years of the First World War, when in 1915 this Malay-Italian dictionary they had published was reprinted. There's a second thing which is important when you look at those years, but which I will not mention now. I will come back to that in the next slide. Let us consider for a moment why precisely Indian printers and Indian publishers were able to play a role in the Malay sphere in the late 19th century. The first thing that we have to consider here is that by the time printing really took off in Singapore amongst not only the European communities and the missionaries, but amongst the various Asian communities as well, we have a well-established printing industry in India in the hand of Indians. This really goes back to the year 1835 with Act 11 of that year, passed by the British government in India, or rather by the East India Company government, which permitted Indians for the first time to own printing presses. So what that meant was that Indians within a relatively short amount of time pick up this business of printing. And with that, of course, come two aspects that we often tend to underplay a little bit. The first thing is, if you run a printing shop, you have to have a certain technical expertise. That is, a printer is not something that you can do just because you want to do it. You need to have a certain amount of training. You need to know how to operate the machine. You need to know, well, the tricks of the trade. And this is something which is important for the Malay publishing houses really in two, and Malay publishing in general, really in two ways. In the late 19th century, we have two technologies of printing. One is traditional letterpress printing. That is, for every letter, you have a little, usually lead font, which is then set. You produce the larger text and you print with that, right? That is basically the Gutenberg technology, which is very useful for scripts such as the Roman script or also the Tamil script, where you have discrete separate letters. But it's not really particularly useful for the Arabic script or the Jawi script, where the letters join up with each other, because you always, in the early period, you see the gap between the letters where the different fonts meet in the printing press. And on the other side, you already had a technology called lithography, which allowed basically handwritten text and even images to be transferred into printing. And Indians had become highly familiar with both these technologies, which is why some of the earliest Malay books were actually printed in Bombay, where there were specifically Muslim printers who had specialized in lithographically producing books in the Arabic script in a whole variety of languages. So the technical skills that came with the Indian printers is a very important aspect of this early phase of connection between Indian and specifically Tamil Muslim printers and the Malay publishing houses. The second aspect is the general experience, not only with the technology, but with running a press as an economic enterprise. And this is a very important fact we often forget. These printers were not primarily or not first and foremost in the business because they wanted to print. They also needed to make money. And that was a very important aspect, not only in the sense that, well, you had to have the skills and you had to have to know what goes into your printing press, but you also needed to have connections in order to cover as large a print market as possible. An important aspect also of India in those days is that India, within the Indian Ocean world, acted as a sort of metropole. So connection to India gave you a great access at a market of news that you could actually then import into your own newspapers and publications back in Singapore. And interestingly enough, for the Tamil Muslim printers, one center where they acquired a lot of their news at that time and was not, in fact, India, but actually Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and the city of Colombo, where there were a number of Tamil Muslim newspapers located at that time, who in turn had their own connections to Egypt, to a number of Arab countries, etc., and therefore acted as a sort of distribution point for news, for information, for opinions within the wider Indian Ocean world. Finally, a big advantage of these Indian Straits-born Indian printers, of course, was precisely their location at the boundaries of various communities. So I've already pointed out, we are talking about people who are well fitted both within the Indian and the Malay communities, who therefore actually have the linguistic skills to serve both Tamil and Malay publics. And on top of that, many of them had a knowledge of English, which also permitted them to print documents, books, etc. in English. So what this brings to your press is not only that you are able to connect with a larger set of communities, but yet again, looking at the economic aspect, it is a very important thing if you need to make money, to have more possible audiences coming to you to get their printing done. And this is particularly important with regard to one particular aspect. If you think back yet again to the last slide where I talked about the Nodaya Press and their publications, if you look at that list of Tamil and Malay books and newspapers that were printed by this press, you count every title, you count every reprint of every title, and in one case you have a newspaper that ran for 3 years. You have 20 publications in that list. Now, Dinodaya Press operated from 1875, 1873 possibly, but first publication we have is 1875 to at least 1915. These are 40 years. You have 20 publications in 40 years. That means you basically have one publication every 2 years. And everyone can calculate that this is not going to make your business, right? So these books and newspapers, which we now see as the prime products of these early printing presses, were really only the tip of the iceberg. Most of the everyday printing that happened at these presses were of a different nature. These were well, what we would nowadays call advertisements, that is handbills that advertised shops and goods, stickers that were to be posted on the walls with announcements and again, advertisements, invitations for weddings or other kinds of functions, for religious celebrations, etc. We basically have nothing left of these kind of publications, but we know about them because because Makhdum Sahib, the owner of Dinodaya Press, actually talks in his Tamil newspapers about that publishing these newspapers, he's not really interested in making money because he actually makes his money with these sort of everyday printing jobs. So him publishing these newspapers is really more of a community service than an actual economic enterprise. But of course, if you are dependent on these kind of day-to-day publications, again, your location at the boundary of various linguistic communities is very important in order basically to increase your market share and increase your sort of slice within the print market of those times. And this gave the Indian printers a very decided economic edge. Now, what does that mean for the sort of encounter between Malay and Tamil and a sort of, if we may call it like that, cross-fertilization between these two languages in terms of their printing industry? There are, of course, the odd products like the image you see here on the right-hand side. This is in one of the poetry collections published by the Jawi Peranakan Press. It's a Tamil poetry collection, but within that Tamil poetry collection, you find this poem in Malay language, but printed in the Tamil script. So it says, for those who can maybe read it, Bukit Larangan, Bukit Bandara, Sikandar Shah, Tiang Negara. That is the refrain of the poem. So addressed to the Karamat on Fort Canning Hill, to Sikandar Shah. But these are really sort of odd products. We don't find too much of these kind of interesting little mixtures between Malay and Tamil. But one way in which the encounter between Indian printers and Malay publishing really has an important impact is that they create something like a common public sphere for these Malay and Tamil speaking communities. And in that, I would say, lie a first stirring of an engagement with politics, with local politics in Singapore. So if we go back to what I said at the very beginning, there's a tendency amongst historians when they search for politics in colonial Singapore amongst the Asian communities to assume, well, the Chinese would have been invested in politics regarding China, the Indians would have been invested in Indian nationalism, the Malays would have been invested in sort of Malay identity, possibly something like Islamic, pan-Islamic identities. So we assume that there is a compartmentalized politics for different ethnic communities. But in reality, this is one of the surprising things for anyone who reads this Singai Nesan Tamil newspaper. You realize this is a newspaper which is highly imprecated with pan-Islamic identities. And even creates a lot of discourse around how Muslims all over the globe have started resisting colonialism. There's a lot of sympathy for the Ottoman Empire in the early Tamil Muslim press. And in effect, I would say this is actually stronger in the early Tamil newspapers than in the early Malay newspapers. So in a sense, this role played by Tamil Muslims in Malay publishing is partly to pave the way later on in the early 20th century for a greater influx of Muslim discourse from the Middle East, of reformist discourses that were first tried out in a sense by these Tamil Muslim publishers. Specifically in the case of Malay, I think one of the big important roles played by these Tamil publishers is the extension of Malay beyond a sort of traditional religious and literary sphere. So as Proudfoot has noticed, the early Jawi Peranakan or Tamil Muslim publishers, they were not a particularly large group within Malay publishing. But if you compare their publications to the publications you get from other Malay publishing houses in the late 19th century, you see that they are the ones who actually bring in a lot of the quote-unquote modern publications, whether it be newspapers, whether it be dictionaries, these kind of football rules that we find. And as I already said, also in terms of content, these early sort of political discourses. So I think this is one particular heritage which the Tamil Muslims, in a sense, have given the Malay side. For the Tamil side, it's even easier to describe the benefits because it's pretty obvious we probably wouldn't have had a Tamil publishing industry in Singapore for a few more decades had the Tamil Muslims not been able to sort of tap into the Malay market to basically make their business and then be able to publish these Tamil publications, Tamil language publications, which probably weren't too economic, but which they could afford to publish in a sense as community service because they actually were able to tap into this larger Malay print market. So to a certain degree, for at least the first 3 to 4 decades of the history of Tamil printing in Singapore, Tamil to a certain degree piggybacks on Malay publishing. I am almost through with the time, so let me very, very briefly in the last slide also say something about reasons why this very, very prominent early mix of, so when we talk about this early period, you can't really speak about Tamil or Malay publishing houses because all these publishing houses are both Tamil and Malay publishing houses. And this particular setup declines in the course of the early 20th century. And there are 2 prime reasons for that. One big point of change, one big turning point is the First World War, which many of these printers have to fold up in the First World War precisely because of the paper shortages and the fact that the government tended to allocate paper to a greater degree to English publishing houses than to vernacular publishing houses. And the First World War also brings censorship in a far stricter sense to Singapore than was the case before the First World War. But even more important, with that period, the first decades of the 20th century, is the rise of nationalism. And here Tamil Muslims suddenly find themselves at a disadvantage. What was earlier their advantage, namely that they could, in a sense, service different communities within Singapore. This advantage gets lost with the role that nationalism begins to play in publishing. Because now, finally, there are Malays who say, we Malays should publish and print and represent ourselves. These Indian Muslims and Arab Muslims shouldn't come in the way. But this was not only the case for Tamil Muslims in the case of interacting with the Malays, it's even the case for these Tamil Muslims in interacting with other Indians. Because they were not able also to say, well, we are the prime representative of Tamils in Singapore. Because by that time, you had a far larger share of Tamil Hindus who would say, no, actually, the Tamil identity is sort of covered by us. They were a small minority or relatively small minority amongst the Indians. So they couldn't simply become the torchbearers of Indian nationalism. And even among Indian Muslims, the North Indian Urdu-speaking Muslims were actually the ones who dominated this slowly rising form of Indian Muslim nationalism that ultimately leads to the formation of Pakistan. So none of these national communities Tamil Muslims could actually claim to represent. And this is one of the prime reasons, I would say, for the slow decline that we see in the early 20th century of Tamil Muslims engaging in publishing, and of the rise of more nationally defined Malay publishing houses, Tamil language publishing houses, etc. That's it from my side. I thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to Azhar presenting his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Thorsten. That was a very rich presentation and a lot of insights. There are 3 points that actually struck me in your presentation. Firstly, as a result of the Act 11 in 1835 that allowed Indians to own printing presses, you find that there's a flourishing of printing of publications, and that precedes actually the printing presses in the Malay world. In fact, I was struck when you mentioned that some of the earlier Malay texts were actually published in Bombay. So that was one aspect. And the second one was actually how it paved the way to reformist discourse in the Malay community that eventually linked it to the reformist ideas that were coming from Egypt. So that precedes this whole process that we are familiar with in our part of the world, in the Malay world. And thirdly was how nationalism, interestingly, developed along communal lines, and that goes against the common understanding that nationalism binds everyone together. But this is in the post World War I, it goes along communal lines. So thank you so much for these very rich insights that can actually propel further discussions later. For our viewers, there's a QR code below. You can scan and you can post your comments as well as your questions, and we'll pick them up later during the Q&A segment. But for now, we'll move on to Dr. Azhar Ibrahim. Of course, Dr. Azhar Ibrahim is a well-known figure and doesn't need much introduction, but anyway, I'll read his biodata. Dr. Azhar Ibrahim is currently lecturer at the Department of Malay Studies at the National University of Singapore. He teaches Malay Indonesian literature and ideologies of development at the department. In addition to his academic work, he is also chairman of the Literary Committee Malay Language Council, chairman of Advisory Panel Malay Language Service National Library Board, as well as the vice chairman of the Malay Heritage Foundation. And his research interests include sociology of literature, social theology, Islamic thought, critical literacy, and the Malay Indonesian intellectual development. And he has many books under his arms. And of course, Dr. Azhar is one of the foremost experts to talk about this topic today. And I now invite Dr. Azhar to deliver his presentation. Dr. Azhar, please.
Thank you, Imran. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would say selamat petang, vandakum, to all our friends here, Prof. Yaakob, Mr. Arun, Mr. Zahidi, and our friends from the CSTC, our friends in Budhi and all those viewers at home. I'm glad to share this afternoon, and actually, Imran, all the 3 gentlemen here actually can anytime speak about Kampong Gelam or speak about colonial Singapore, but because Imran and Mr. Arun is always a nice man, and I very much appreciate their effort often to start many initiatives on the discursive platform in Singapore and therefore I think it's a good Saturday afternoon for me to get back to some of my old notes and share some of my readings on this point. All right. Let me start. This is the title that I want to deliberate. Kampong Gelam, a story of pioneering publishers and autochthonous intellectual dissemination, or if you want to say disseminator. And in extension to Professor Torsten's deliberations on the role of Tamil Muslim, yeah, I will also speak the other group, yeah, which is the Jawi Peranakan, also, yeah, Jawi Peranakan, otherwise also known as Jawi Pekan. Yeah. Pekan means city, yeah. Yeah. So Malays who live in the city, yeah, or sometimes known as Melayu Tanjung. Yeah. So the Indian Muslim who are Peranakan, yeah, with Indian ancestry, perhaps one of their mothers will be of Malay parentage. Yeah? All right, let me start with this quotation from William Raw. We know very well about Singapore being recognized, as a center of Melayu Muslim cultural, intellectual, transit center. We know many historians have appreciated that. And even some will dub to call Singapore as New York for Malaya or even Nusantara. But then a question that we can ask, which part of Singapore? Right? And if you read based on many materials, it's actually Kampong Gelam. Kampong Gelam is the New York for the intelligentsia, the cultural literatis, even businessmen from the region, yeah, stopping here, and some of them stayed here, and some of them stayed for very long and they become Singaporean, yeah? So this is a sketch by Latif Muhyiddin, very interesting. On actually, I think one of his experience, Latif Muhyiddin, well-known visual artist in Malaysia, yeah? We know about his paintings, yeah? So I think he sketched about his past experience in Kampong Gelam. All right, I'll go very quickly on this point, yeah? On the arrival of printing press, of course, first introduced by Christian missionaries, yeah? The American Christian missionary, and of course, Abdullah, yeah, Munshi Abdullah, who's also one can be called as Jawi Peranakan, yeah? Hail from Malacca. And Abdullah was instrumental in this project of publication of Malay materials, yeah? And of course, he learned it from the Christian missionary. And if you look at what kind of things that Abdullah contributed, yeah, many things, of course. He wrote, he became the teacher to many Europeans, even Raffles and many European figures, but most importantly, his intellectual work, yeah, in terms of publication. He, in fact, collaborated with Tambi Mutu, yeah, Tambi Mutu Birapatar, yeah, to translate this Tamil text into Malay, becoming Hikayat Pancatanderan. Yeah? So that's, he collaborated, because I think he wants to make sure that his Tamil is correct, so he has this Tambi Mutu to help him. Yeah? And of course, Abdullah was also, Abdullah was known for Abdullah Padri because of his work with the missionary, but actually, many students actually studied under him. One of them is actually Muhammad Azhari bin Kemas Haji Abdullah, a man from Palembang, stopped over here, and then he learned something about the trade of printing. And of course, this student of Abdullah, yeah, Ibrahim bin Hussein, yeah, Sahab Nagor, yeah, so he hailed from this part of India, and he lived in Singapore. So these two men actually were very instrumental in the publication of the first printed Quran in Southeast Asia, the Palembang Quran, 1848, sorry. That's very early, right? So Azhari wrote, in fact, in the first part of the Quran of how, yeah, he went to learn from Munshi Abdullah, and of course, the printer he mentioned, Encik Ibrahim bin Hussein. Yeah? Sahab Nagor, he said. Yeah? All right. So that's about all. Just want to give a broad sketch about, we have here the Indian connection, so-called. Yeah? Now, we know about Singapore, or as a robust publishing trade, and it happened, of course, the locality, specifically in Kampong Gelam. Why is that so? Very quickly, we know about the availability of expertise and capital, right? Relative sizable reading community, including formation of schools. So actually, there were two areas, Malay-speaking areas in Singapore, actually three. Yeah? One is Kampong Gelam, the other one is Telok Blangah, and the other one is the Eastern Belt. Yeah? These are the three main areas. But what is interesting, if we do comparison, actually, the first Malay school and the first Malay college for teacher training is actually in Telok Blangah. But Telok Blangah never took off. Why is that so? It's very interesting. Because one of the reasons is actually the fact that the Temenggung family packed up and then they established Johor Bahru by 1855. Yeah? So many talented ones moved up north, including Munshi Abdullah son, Munshi Ibrahim. Yeah? So Munshi Ibrahim was one of the talented ones that moved up north. But those who in Kampong Gelam stayed and flourished. Yeah? And then they make history, actually. Yeah? So we know about, Singapore was also the center of pilgrimage transit. Haji Lin testified it. There was a political stability, British laissez-faire attitude. There's no overt intervention, and Singapore was dubbed as the cultural center of the Malayo-Muslim world in Southeast Asia. That's William Zroff's statement. And Ian Profruff, Australian scholar, noted that from 1840s, 85% of books in Malay, that was actually coming from this region, were printed in Singapore. Can you imagine a huge production? And because many of the printers come here to do their work and to escape from Dutch censorship. By 1890s, this amounted to an average of 50,000 books each year. That's a staggering, we can't even reach that level today. So this is really history making. If you look at Ian Profruff's scholarship, you'll be very surprised of the number of works being compiled. All right, next, why we need to look at Kampong Gelam? I think it's where I would say where all the hub began. There is a dynamics of Malay language publication that reflects also then the composition of Malay leadership and its intelligence. Okay. There's a history of printing press that was integral in the intellectual development. The printing press means not just the newspaper, but also book production. It is, of course, a cultural, intellectual hub, right, which later on, if we accumulate all this history, it can explain very well why the emergence of 1950s local literati with the formation of Asas 50 and the Malay film industry. Nothing can exist in vacuum. There must be infrastructure built on. And it started in 19th century, it started in Kampong Gelam. Okay. So then we also say that the quarter had also been the stopover of many regional intelligentsia. In fact, if you read many autobiographies of Malay political activists, many of them said that they have stopped over in Kampong, including Indonesian nationalists. One of them is Mas Marco Katodikromo, which was around in this region, in this area in 1915, right? Before just about less than one day, the British packed him up and then sent him back to the Dutch, to Java. All right, so the publishers in the Malay newspaper, journals, and books, let's say, we have, of course, it started by, we know, the Tamil Muslim, right? Followed by the Peranakan, the Indian Peranakan, we call it Jawi Pekan. Of course, the huge bulk of it, the production is actually in the hands of Javanese publisher. Of course, there is entrance of the Arabs and Malay nobilities, yeah, not many, but and then later on, in the second or third decades of the 20th century, we see local Malays, as in Malay will, sometimes say that, ini Jawi Pekan, ini Melayu Jati, that kind of nationalistic sentiment, right? So I don't know whether with me and Imran, I don't know which one is the real Malay, yeah? So there's always a debate, on those, yeah? All right. Of course, the categories of operation, in terms of their production, and when we're talking about book worlds, yeah. So it involved the production of not just the book itself, but of course the journalists, the editors we're talking about, the bookseller, the distributor, the book printers, and of course maybe also lending libraries. Because if you look at some old Malay texts, they will say that, you can pay, you can borrow this with some more money, but of course, please don't destroy the book, blah, blah, blah. Yeah? And this Al-Hamadiyah Press is one example. Yeah? Actually, just behind this Kampong Gelam Istana. Yeah? This is, I will come back later, the formation of this Al-Hamadiyah Press. The types of work produced, of course, we know, first of all, as early as Quranic publication was slightly later in Singapore. There was a Singapore Quran production. Yeah? Interestingly, I think last year, NLB bought one copy, yeah? Which is meant for Achinese market. Yeah? Then we have kitabs, and many interestingly, that kitabs of the 17th century were printed in Singapore because of the popularity of this kitab. Kitab is actually a Jawi script Malay works on religious themes. Yeah? And of course, pilgrimage manuals, and then literary works, Hikayat and Syair were very popular then. Right? It's the reading material of that period, and of course, newspaper and magazines. Yeah? So this is Sekolah Melayu. This is one of the rival, I have not shown yet, the rival to this Jawi Peranakan publication, by also the title Jawi Peranakan by Saidi Press, as mentioned by Professor Torsten earlier. All right, and this is the Quran that being produced in Singapore, and this is, I think, the one, as in the script, were written by Tengku Yusuf bin Tengku Ibrahim in Kampong Gelam, and it used the Terengganu style, and it was mentioned that Encik Muhammad Noor bin Haji Ismail as the printer, most probably a Javanese printer. Right? Why is that so? Why the Javanese come into this active participation? Among others, actually, they also escaped from the Dutch strict supervision. Yeah? And in Singapore, if you want to do your intellectual work, you want to do your business, it's always Singapore, right? So it's quite, and most of them stayed here, and of course they stayed in the area vicinity to Kampong Gelam, which is called Kampong Jawa. Yeah, right? The Malays don't call Arab Street, Malay call Kampong Jawa. Yeah? My mother, will I say Arab Street, she won't know. She will only remember Kampong Jawa. Yeah? So what's the audience like in mid-19th century, late 19th century? We have the ordinary reading public, not many, but of course at least it is a town center. Right? There are middle class coming up wanting good reading materials. School children, regional networks, Javanese kitabs published in Singapore was highly demanded. In fact, it's quite interesting if you go to Indonesian pesantren today, and then some kiai will take pride that they have all copies of kitabs that came from Singapore. That was actually the 19th century kitabs. Yeah? And of course, I mentioned just now lending libraries, and of course, Malay being the lingua franca of the island. Yeah? It's not just read by the Malays, it's also read by the Chinese Peranakan, right? The Malays themselves, the Indian Muslim, or those who can read Malay, of course, the Jawi Peranakan, the Eurasian, and many more. Yeah? All right, then this is actually the early Malay newspaper. We know that Jawi Peranakan is the first Malay language newspaper in Jawi script, right, 1876. But the first two was actually from Surabaya. Yeah? Surat Khabar Bahasa Melayu, this is the one, published in Surabaya. Yeah? And then the other one is Alamat Langkapuri, published in Sri Lanka. Right? And because there's this Malay diaspora in Sri Lanka, and in fact there are many actually Malay texts also been published there, right? If you study classical Malay, very interesting. Some of the texts originated from Sri Lanka, and this and then later on after 76 you see. All came up from Singapore. Yeah, nothing that persists well except Jawi Peranakan. Right, Jawi Peranakan persisted well, I think, because of good management. Yeah, and Sekolah Melayu was the rival actually. Sekolah Melayu, was also by a Jawi Peranakan editor or person who owns it, and the Sekolah Melayu men actually. Actually they were competing such that, they decreased the subscription rate. Yeah? And then, and then you can see in the writings in Jawi Peranakan, the editors, silah, nilah Melayu, always like to compete. Yeah? But actually, they're not Melayu, they are Jawi Peranakan. That's very interesting how they define themselves as Malays. Yeah? And then we have the entry into the foray is 1894, Bintang Timur, which is another Peranakan, but Baba Peranakan. Right. One is Indian Peranakan and one is Chinese Peranakan. Right? And this is the Baba Peranakan papers are in Romanized Malay. Yeah. Okay. So this is Jawi Peranakan, you see. Yeah. Okay, the competing realms here, as you see, the publication world in Singapore was a competing realm in that sense. Yeah? From the start, we have the Christians who wanted to promote their evangelical work. Yeah? Bustanul Arifin, Cermin Mata, so we know that. Yeah? And then later on, the Jawi Peranakan Press came. Only 1906, you find one group of Muslim conscious reformist group led by Syed Al-Hadi formed Al-Imam. Al-Imam within this vicinity, not within Kampong Gelam itself. Yeah? I remember the exact date, location of the street. Then we have, there's another group in Singapore, Malay speaking, this is Haji Abbas Taha. This man in this image is Haji Abbas Taha, which later became Kadi Besar of Singapore. So the Kadi Besar of Singapore, before he was appointed as Kadi Besar of Singapore, the Chief Kadi of Singapore, he was in this competition with Syed Al-Hadi between Neraca and Al-Imam. Right. Yeah? So it's quite interesting. Yeah? And then, of course, the Melayu Jadi group came later by the appearance of this young man, Yunus Abdullah. Okay? All right, so I said, the competitions between Neraca and Utusan Melayu. All right, my apologies. Yeah? Because Neraca took up more Islamic things, whereas Utusan Melayu take more like kind of national Malay themes. Yeah? All right, and then a few others like Lembaga Melaya, if I'm not mistaken, is Arab-owned. So you can see the kind of a competition. Everyone wants to be in this part and parcel of the what do you call it, creating and managing a discourse. Right? If you see this terrain, it's not just publishing industry. It is a field of intellectual competition. Yeah? And later on, a new group of Malays came forward after the formation of 1939, Kesatuan Melayu Muda, Kesatuan Melayu Singapura, and then later on, Encik Yusof Isha and the rest joined the foray. Okay, so I just want to, this is the list of Malay publisher. You can see the names here in Kampong Gelam, right? And here you see the names is different from the Tamil Muslim names and the Jawi Peranakan. You can tell roughly, yeah? This is mostly of Javanese ancestry. Yeah? Okay? Except, for example, all right. Okay, so this is a huge list, and I think it's Imran. I would love to continue this talk because 30 minutes not possible. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, the pioneers of the newspaper, we have Munshi Muhammad Said Dada Muhyiddin. There are 3 men. Yeah. Said Mahmud bin Said Abdul Karim Al-Hindi, and then later on Munshi Muhammad Ali Gulam Al-Hindi. So they like to say, the last name. Yeah. Let's say Imran lah, he lives in Pasirin, Al-Pasirisi, yeah, okay. All right, so it's the origin. And here, this man is one of the most respected men who also taught part-time as teacher at RI, yeah, and he was actually the leading figure behind Jawi Peranakan until his death in 1888, yeah. Okay, and he studied this very interesting man, Hakim Abdullah. Yeah? Hakim, it's quite interesting to note that some Malay courts needed some people to be able to write Tamil. Especially Kedah had a long relation with Tamil-speaking principality in India. So Hakim Abdullah needed to be the one who wrote, because we have evidence to show that the Kedah court sent letters, Tamil letters, right? Whereas in some other parts of Southeast Asia, like in Bali, Madura, and so on, they need a scribe that can write Malay. Because when they want to write to the Dutch, it's not possible, right? Of their own native language. They have to write in Malay because Dutch can't read the rest. Yeah? All right, so we have another Munshi Muhammad Ali bin Gulam Al-Hindi. Same thing, he set up the weekly Sekolah Melayu, as I've mentioned just now, the rival. Yeah? And he was also the author of Hikayat Gulba Kawali, yeah? A translation of the Hindu tale. And then we have another one who was also an editor of Taman Pengetahuan by Said Mahmud bin Said Abdul Qadir. Yeah? Said normally people associated with Arabs, yeah? But not in this case. Yeah? Still within the, within the Peranakan sites. Yeah? Yeah? All right, this is very interesting. The task now is to look at the kind of expression, the kind of contents, the kind of concerns in this paper. Yeah? So among others, we see in as early as 11th of July, yeah, 1887, this column, yeah, written on the importance of standard language usage. Yeah? So among others, there's a claim that actually we are better Malay than the rest. We use better Malay. Just like Abdullah lah, you all don't learn your language. See, we learn our language, So this is a claim. Here is example. Syabas bahawasanya dapatlah kita katakan, adapun membangkitkan asyik mereka itu tiada hanyalah Jawi Peranakan ini. The only one who use good standard Malay is us. Yeah? So, of course, it's a selling point, you see, right? And then, when the first Tamil newspaper, this is a Malay spelling, Shengkai Nisan. New Kids on the Block arrived, it's a Tamil newspaper. Jawi Peranakan announced, you see, we welcome, we welcome this newspaper, right? And it says that, we hope it will stay for long, and indeed it stayed quite long, yeah, as just now Prof. Torsten mentioned. So this is from Jawi Peranakan. So okay, I think they were friends. Sure, they were friends, right? Because they borrow news, from each other. Yeah, then they print it out in their own paper. Yeah? And then, of course, Jawi Peranakan was also, generally quite subdued politically. But there are some pieces you can see, how, they manifest their criticism against the British. Yeah? For example, the British interference in Muslim affairs. Yeah? So you can see the date 87, yeah? Okay. I will not go, I'm just mentioning here, it's the kind of thing, yeah? The language pollution and deterioration, this is one, yeah? Just now they claim that this is, we take care Bahasa Melayu better than the rest, but this one is actually the kind of usage, yeah, of what they call colloquial usage. It says this is not right, engkau, aku, lu, and then, this is another interesting one, they were not happy the way the Europeans, when they talk to us, they talk to the Malays. The Malays, when they speak to the Europeans, they use, honorary words and titles, but not for the case when the Europeans speak to us. So, just like this one, similar to Kartini. Kartini mentioned this actually in her letters, the way the Dutch treated the Javanese, in terms of language usage. And in Sekolah Melayu, this is where they are directed at school, the reading materials. This Munshi Muhammad Ali Al-Hindi wrote about the liberal usage of English. Today, all the Malay cikgus will not happy lah. This is the pollution of Malay language, blah blah blah. In 1889, we have already that problem. Okay. All right. Then it says that he also feared that more and more people speaking English. Just like today, right? This month we have this debate, discussion, not debate. There's no debate here. Discussion, on the usage of Malay. Inilah kata daripada bahasa Inggeris telah menjadi basahan di sekolah-sekolah Melayu. English being used widely in Malay school. So, see, this is Jawi Peranakan. They are the one who always speak up. Nah, another interesting one, these are example, these are English words that being used amongst the teachers and school kids. They are not happy. So this is in newspaper. I think the newspaper is very interesting then, as compared to, of course, our, okay, all right. So, in Jawi Peranakan, there are many reports and so on and so forth, and among others, actually also about the formation of, let's say, the word, you want to use club or you want to use persekutuan, right? Like today lah, you want to call many words lah in Malay nowadays is a problem now, Okay, anyway, some clubs being mentioned here, Persatuan Darul Al-Adab, no longer in existence. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Jawa Al-Masakin. Maybe around, right? All right. And this is interesting. The clash of the Peranakan. Two newspapers, Jawi Pekan, the Indian Peranakan, and we have Bintang Timur, Baba Peranakan. One letter wrote in Baba Peranakan Bintang Timur, mengapa Melayu-layu? Why are the Malays withering away? It's actually the issues of Malay underdevelopment. And then it says that, I wrote, this is a series of articles. So what is very interesting is about to explain, the reason why the Malay were backward, because of what, among others, cultural conservatism, slavish to outmoded customs, effective leadership who only good at opium, women and gambling, and their lack of industry ambition, hostility towards talented people, all these stereotypes and so on and so forth, right? But it claimed that, we want to say this because we care about you. And then, what happened? The editors of Jawi Peranakan lashed back. You don't understand. We know the Malays better. Wow, so there is. Except that, if you want to know what is actually the reply of Jawi Peranakan, wait for my next lecture. All right? I will give, It's very interesting because, it's these materials to show the kind of debates in Singapore at that time. And where were the Malays? Right? Where were the Malays in this discussion? Not yet. Until 1920 and 30s. Then you can see Malays are more vocal in that sense. Okay. So, prominent book publisher. This is I mentioned about, and I have all the address. Maybe our friends in Malay Heritage Center can do a trail. 43 Sultan Road. This is the Javanese publishers who are very active. Now I move on to the Javanese publisher. So some of the works that he mentioned, he produced a lot of work actually. His father was Muhammad Saleh Al-Rambani. He came from Rembang in Java. And okay, so this is actually the catalog. If you want to buy books, we have this, okay? If you can't read, yeah, we have translated for you. This one. Yeah? So this is Haji Muhammad bin Haji Muhammad Saleh, Tukang Cap, nombor 43, Sultan Road, blah, blah, blah. If you want to buy, there's a price. Yeah? Ringgit atau sen 30. Yeah? And so on and so forth. Yeah? So it tells us about, you know, the reading consumption. Yeah? And then these are some of the works that literary works alone, literary works. Even I'm teaching classical Malay today, I can't cover all. Yeah, you can see, you know, the kind of taste, yeah. I think they have a taste for good things, yeah? Literary works, yeah. And then, of course, regional linkages. Yeah, the Tamil Muslim could not move, yeah, among others, yeah, in terms of publication because the lack of regional, what I call it, context. The Javanese have a regional context here. So they have in Penang, Taiping, Tapa, Kuching, Malacca, Batavia. Yeah? So, you know, they mention even, and then also they mention, you know, some people have not been paying subscription. You know? Yeah, all right. You know, if you don't pay, we will publish it. Yeah? Okay. All right. So here again, names of the publisher. Yeah, and there's a copyright warning. It's interesting. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So it says here that you can read the English translation in yellow, I read in Malay. Barang siapa yang melanggar tegahnya ini tak dapat tiada dibawalah mereka ke hadapan mahkamah dan dituduh mereka pencuri, maka aiblah nama mereka dan dihukumkan pula. Oh, yeah. Even the Malay is very expressive. Yeah? Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay, Al-Imam, 1906. I think it deserves a lecture on its own, but I'll just to mention that this is spearheaded by the, I would say, a more reformist and more aristocratic background group. Yeah, yeah. This is where the Arabs and the Malay nobilities, right? So the Al-Ahmadiyya Press are Malay nobilities, right? That came from the Riau Sultanate, yeah, and then they operated their business here. Yeah. These are Malay publishing houses, you can see, yeah. And their address, some of them like Al-Ahmadiyya, Harmi Press, same thing. Yeah. And reminiscence of Kampong Gelam, many Malay literati, major ones, you know, if you read their memoirs, and they mention a lot about Kampong Gelam. Yeah. And of course, among others, Latif Muhyiddin, I've mentioned just now. Harun Amir Rashid alone, he's one of our literary pioneers, Singapore literary pioneers. You see the publisher that published his work. All of these publishers were based in Kampong Gelam again, right? These are a whole list, yeah? And in 1963, Pustaka Nasional, yeah, was actually first formed here in Kandahar, 40 Kandahar Street, right? And I would say that the cultural milia was created in Kampong Gelam that gave rise to the emergence of cultural brokers. The cultural brokers were Tamil Muslim, Jawi Peranakan, what I call it, the Javanese publishers, and the rest of the community. Yeah? Okay, all right. I think these are some of the references that I will share these materials later. On that note, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Azhar. I could have listened to you for 1 hour more, but we have to move on to the next segment. Again, just a reminder for friends who are watching live, there's a QR code at the bottom of your screen, and you can submit your questions and comments through that. You know, as you mentioned that in 1890s, 50,000 books were printed here. And of course, 85% of books in 1840 were printed in Singapore. That's amazing. And when you mention about how local literatis, including the formation of Asas 50 and also the Malay film industry, that could not have emerged without the earlier emergence of the printing industry and the spread of ideas and transmission of knowledge. So there is this clear connection between the vibrancy of the discursive scene and the emergence of the material culture. And sometimes, we think, how do we get the film industry back on its foot, but we don't think about the discursive space that actually led to the vibrancy of the material culture that emerged. So I think those are things that we can learn from history. And also the idea of competition that has actually led to this flourishing of the whole industry, right? If you just have one newspaper, for instance, without competition, maybe, it's something that we can discuss of how it actually impedes the development of ideas and the vibrancy of the whole scene. So competition can be a good thing because it challenges us to be better, right? And of course, a very important point you notice on the rootedness of the Jawi Peranakan and the contributions in the wider Malay community. It's not something that is segregated and something that is seen as a separate community. And that speaks about the intercultural elements that we are raising in this theme today. So there's a lot of convergence that I see with your presentation with Dr. Thorsten. So Dr. Thorsten, welcome back. And there will be, there are some questions through the audience, and maybe I can pose this to Dr. Thorsten first. When Tamil Muslims were not allowed to represent the different communities, were there still outliers publishing groups or companies, or was it completely, oh sorry, this thing moved. Sorry, my eyes are not very, yeah, did it completely stop? Yeah, maybe we'll take that question first. Dr. Thorsten?
Yeah. I mean, first and foremost, let me specify this. We are not speaking about a ban. It was simply difficult for them within a discursive field where people were clamoring about who is the true Melayu Jati or who are the best Indians, to claim that they are central to any of these communities. So there is further Tamil Muslims engaged in a number of public ventures, but they are by and large peripheral to these ventures, at least to the public side of these ventures. So in the 1930s, you have the Tamils Reform Association being formed. And when you look at the official lists of who are the members, who are the people who are leading this group, you will find next to no Muslims. But I have talked to people who said actually the Muslims were quite active, but they were deliberately keeping them from taking official positions because the fear was the Tamils Reform Association was criticizing a lot of religious practices, Hindu religious practices. So they were afraid that if the Muslims are too prominent in the group, that the conservative Hindus would say this is basically a Muslim group trying to attack our religion. So these were the kind of difficulties they had to negotiate. And there are still one or two publications you find by Tamil Muslims in that time. But they are then mostly really about Islam and in Tamil. So they represent themselves as Tamil Muslims, but they don't represent the wider Tamil community in the way that Hindus can.
Yeah, interesting. There's a question that is quite similar, and it's a follow-up maybe to what you have mentioned. Does the identity crisis of Tamil Muslims still continue to exist in Singapore? I'm not sure if you're able to answer that. Maybe Mr. Arun will be best placed to answer that. But what are your thoughts, Dr. Thorsten?
Well, if you actually read the book that I've written, I would say to a certain degree that identity crisis is precisely imposed. The imposition comes from the fact that you have this idea that, well, the Indian community is predominantly Tamil, predominantly Hindu, the Malay community or the Muslim community is predominantly Malay. Now you're a Tamil Muslim, that makes you you might say, a Malay by religion and a Hindu by race, right? That's the confusion that arises. But that's exactly the categories that weren't there in that same form in the 19th century. In the 19th century, when Indian Muslims acted in the Malay context, they would claim this Jawi Peranakan identity, even if they didn't have any Malay parentage. Right? We can see that with a number of people where we know even the mothers were Indians, but still they would say, we're Jawi Peranakan, we can participate in within Malay circles. We are, in a sense, also Malay, and maybe even our Malay language is better than, as Azhar showed in these articles. That has not persisted. You have these very strict racial categories nowadays. And what is called the Indian Muslim or Tamil Muslim identity crisis is a result of the strictness of these groups. We have Malay on one side, we have Indian on the other side, and you fit into neither. So that would be my answer to that. But so actually I would say in those days, 19th century, early 20th century, there was no identity crisis among Tamil Muslims. Because the reasons that produced the crisis were not there.
Thank you. Azhar, do you have any comments on that? Yeah. Okay. Maybe one question for Dr. Azhar. You know, when you mentioned about this, the printing presses in the Malay community, and in 1848 there was the Palembang Quran, right? What were the reactions generally within the Malay community with the emergence of the printing presses, and particularly with the printing of the Quran? Because in other parts of the Muslim world, there were some reactions, especially from the ulama group. And what about the Malay sector?
Yeah, thank you, Imran. That's a good question. In fact, if you look at the same period, the ulama were in the other parts of Muslim heartland were debating whether it's permissible to use the printing press for any religious purposes, right? But you see, there can be some theologian or ulama who says yes and no, but the reality on the ground, things function quite well. Yeah? In fact, Mecca and Istanbul was also later on catch up with the printing press. Yeah? So luckily in this part of the world, I would say that the ulama group, right, did not represent one group that opposed with the intrusion of what I call colonial modernities. They were conservative, yes, but they were not all out going, destroying, and issuing fatwa, saying that this is, the conservatism was there, but not the hardcore. Like the one we saw in some parts of Middle East. Yeah? So we escaped that kind of unnecessary debate in that sense. Yeah. In fact, when Quran was published, there was hardly any reaction. In fact, it spearheaded because everyone demanded it, the printed Quran. Yeah?
Interesting, because it's not just about the printing of the Quran, but also translation of the Quran was a matter of debate all the way that it was eventually resolved in Al-Azhar University in the later part of the 20th century.
So that's the first Quranic in the Malay version was Mahmud Yunus in 1920s, right? A few groups make noise, but overall, slowly it was accepted. Yeah? For the fact that I think the Malays in this part of the world have been used to some kind of tafsir, tafsir in Malay, right? So there was already a background. It was not just simply, one day you wake up, a new Quran in another language. It was a slow progression made.
Yeah, thank you. There are a couple of questions here also, and I'll go back to Dr. Torsten. In the 20th century, even with the decline of Tamil Muslim publishers, did they come back into action later in the post-war years?
I'm not quite sure about the Tamil publishing in the post-war years and what the ownership patterns were in those days. I mean, you definitely have Tamil Muslims continuously publishing books. But one thing which is, of course, different is when you look at the 19th century, the printer, the publisher, if you have a newspaper, the editor, very often are the same person. So this specialization, you have an owner of the printing press. You have the actual technicians who run the printing press. You have the editors when the printing press has a newspaper. You have, of course, the authors of books. These are, in the 1920s, these are all different people. So you definitely have Tamil Muslims continue as authors. You also have them continue as booksellers. In how far they continued as owning printing presses, I'm not quite sure. Because in any case, when you look already at the 1930s, 1940s, you have actually Chinese publishers print Tamil publications. So this is a business where at some point large printing houses, which are owned by Europeans or they're owned by Chinese, they have the capacities to print all sorts of languages. So you don't really have this editor, printer, publisher in a unified person that you had in the 19th century.
Yeah. You know, in some of these early publications that you mentioned, and this comes from another question here, did the Tamil Muslims make reference to their homeland as Singapore or Tamil Nadu?
When any reference to homeland comes up, which actually comes rarely, but most of the times it's India. Or you have the phrase Swadesham, so Swadesh, the home country, which again is generally India, or you have the exact town where somebody or somebody's family came from. Like you had in the case of this gentleman, Sahib Nagur, right? You would specify the town. But interestingly enough, at the same time, you have individuals who put the Southeast Asian town name together with their name. So you find names such as Penang Abdul Qadir or Singapore Ghulam Muhyiddin as the owner of Dinodaya Press. So this is something you wouldn't see nowadays. So even if people are born in Singapore, they won't call themselves, I don't think Arun will call himself Singapore Arun Mahirnath. So that is something that you do see in the 19th century.
Yeah, thank you so much. Now, maybe I go to Dr. Azhar. You listed a long list of all these publications. Yeah? Are copies or replications of the text still available for readers today? And maybe later on, Dr. Thorsten, you can also mention with regards to the Tamil publications.
In terms of studies, yeah, I mean academic studies, there have been a general survey study of its emergence, yeah, but we have yet to see, for example, I've yet to come across a full study on the Jawi Peranakan newspaper. I mean, all the materials put together, right? We have seen one on Al-Imam, for instance, yeah, a PhD done, compilation, and also good news also that I think NUS soon have a complete set of Al-Imam, right? That will be good news. But I was just wondering too, and maybe some of these materials are in the libraries, yeah, and some of them are not available in terms of a complete set to study. We need people to give scholarship, yeah, young people to do a study on all these materials. There's abundant materials out there in the library, but you know, actually we have done very few and very slow. Yeah? I'm sure Professor Thorsten knows about this very well.
Yeah, if exactly, I would like to add to this. So at least as far as the Tamil material is concerned, there is quite a lot at the National Library. They have done a very great service of buying old Tamil books from individuals over the last 20, 30 years. It's there, and the Singai Nesan, that is the first, we might say, successful Tamil newspaper, you can actually read it online. The National Library Board has these online newspaper service, and anyone can go there. You go to browse by newspaper titles, and you can read Singai Nesan online. Every issues that are there, they are scanned, they are readable online. It's a very beautiful service. So some of these things have been very nicely done. There are some very rare publications you find in British Library or also in libraries in India, but by and large, there's by now a lot of things you can do even online.
Thank you. We are running out of time, and there's a couple more questions. So I think some of these questions are like the role of colonialism, as well as the question about integration. This requires lectures on its own, so I will not be asking these questions. But maybe this might be interesting and a very quick response, because Dr. Thorsten just now used the term Peranakan Keling also. And I guess Jamal in the opening also mentioned about how this whole curation started with the Racial Harmony Month. So maybe you can explain a bit about how this term Keling has become derogatory, so that public will understand a bit more. Yeah.
Well, in classical Malay, there's no word for India. Yeah, all right. I mean, India is a term that colonialism created too. Yeah, there is the word Hindi. Yeah, and Bengali. Right, Bengali referring to northern Indians, and then for Keling, it refers normally to southern Indians by virtue that they come from Kalinga. Yeah, so that was an ancient kingdom, yeah. So the Malays only knows the term Keling, yeah. And you know, in geography in Southeast Asia, there are many areas called Tanjung Keling, in Penang, in Malacca, and even there's one in Singapore. There's one in Singapore in Tanjung Keling. But I'm not sure whether in Singapore Tanjung Keling is really inhabited by the Muslim of Indian parentage. I'm not sure about that, yeah. Okay, anyway. So generally it was there, the word Keling, yeah, until I think about the turn of 20th century onwards, where there is this nationalism of phrasing the term DKK, DKA. DKK means Dari Keturunan Keling. That was the start, actually, where it becomes a pejorative, a term, right? Become very negative. In the past, we don't see in that way. And then DKA dari keturunan Arab. So the Jati Melayu, so-called, right? Yeah, wanting to say that, you know, we want to claim, you know, our own. We are different from the DKK and the DKA. That was the start. But in Indonesia, it's very interesting, right? If you go to Deep Java, they don't also have no words for Indian, and it's Keling, right? It's Keling. It's the Javanese. They will say, no, oh, ini roti Keling, for example. Oh, ini baju Keling, yeah. So it's quite common. It's not derogatory, because only later part when nationalism caught up with this strong ethnic.
So it's interesting because it intersects with the rise of Malay nationalism that wants to identify itself as.
And of course,
the question of being Malay.
Yeah, and Malay nationalism. There are many types of Malay nationalism too, right? The leftist type of Malay nationalism will not buy all this kind of rhetorics. Right? It's the more, I would say, a more myopic, a more parochial type of nationalism that play the racial card. This is actually the problematic ones.
Thank you.
Can I just very briefly add to this? Because interestingly enough, it's not only the Malay context where the term is used. I can warn anyone who wants to read Singai Nesan and who knows Tamil, the word Keling is quite commonly used there as a self-reference. So you find a sentence such as India Vilirunda Vanda Klingkaragal. So Klings who have come from India. And they're talking about themselves, about the people who worship at Masjid Jama' Chulia. So it's the early 20th century, and interestingly enough, the first time I see it raised in a Tamil newspaper that one shouldn't use the term. The editor is a Hindu, he's not a Muslim. So I have the feeling the Tamil Muslims for a long time were quite comfortable using the term.
Yeah. Of course, I must caution here, just because it was okay in the past doesn't mean that we ought to go around using that term now, because language also evolve and the terms has to be understood in the context. Yeah. Okay. I mean, something that comes to mind is the future of intellectual culture, the change in technology, and also the change in reading habits in today's modern context. That is something I think we can discuss the next time around. So we have discussed the historical element and how important it was, but with this change in technology, people are just downloading ebooks now, and it's not so much of printing culture. How does that then shape the future intellectual development of both communities, the Tamil and the Muslims? But I'll just park it there, not for response, and maybe this is one lecture that we can take the next time round. So thank you so much, especially to our viewers also, and to Dr. Torsten and Dr. Azhar, and I now hand back the session to Sudha.
Thank you. Before we close this event, it is my great pleasure and honor to invite Professor Yaacob Ibrahim. Professor Yaacob Ibrahim is now advisor to the president of the Singapore Institute of Technology. Prof. Yaacob Ibrahim, please.
Thank you very much, Arun, good friend, Mr. Zahidi, Dr. Azhar, Dr. Torsten. Dr. Torsten, if I've not seen your face, I wouldn't believe you're a German man. You spoke with such a deep Tamil accent that I thought you were very close to Arun, But I think this is what this topic is all about, that we shouldn't think ourselves in silos. I like the term that you use, the boundaries of race, that it did not exist in the past. People were comfortable in crossing over from different groups to the other. I wish such a culture still exists in Singapore today, given the fact that we have a very strong CMIO model. I sometimes think that those sort of models restrict ourselves too much into certain spaces. It prevents us from crossing over. So I think seminars such as these are very important efforts. I congratulate the Malay Heritage Center, Budhi, and of course CSTC for coming together, because I think when we begin to explore the rich past that we have and how we interacted among the various communities, it shows that we are not all that modern. In fact, they were very modern in their outlook at that time, very progressive in how they see other people as people in which they could relate to, they can discuss with, and share whatever worldview that they may have. I think sometimes when you think about competition that was mentioned by the moderator, when the Malays decided to have their own newspaper, perhaps there was a loss there, because then in a way they did not sort of learn from the Indian newspaper printers, because they bring to the newspapers for the Malay audience news from the rest of the Malay Muslim world, for example. Because we know that the government of India, they called at that time, was actually responsible for the Middle East. They had oversight over the Middle East. So I think in that sense, those opportunities to learn from across the world maybe were sort of short-circuited by having your own newspaper. But I still like to believe that even then, despite having your own newspaper, there was a lot more interaction. I think this is the kind of spirit that we like to see happening nowadays. So that's why I welcome this intercultural seminar series, and I hope that we can continue to have more of such sessions, perhaps in a physical audience rather than this hybrid, because it will allow for greater interaction and more of a discussion. Several takeaways for me, and I think this is not new. First, obviously, the Malays at that time, as mentioned by Azhar, I think because of the newspapers that rise in consciousness and their willingness to participate in public life. One of the things that have always intrigued me when I retired and started reading a bit more was the huge number of Malays that were active in unions and in political societies just after World War II. And you could see many groups. And in fact, most of the groups were actually in Kampong Gelam itself, basically. So as mentioned earlier, they have to be this receptacle first, this platform first, that you realize that going into that area, you tap upon its rich history, and therefore it allows you to basically also develop your own modes, your own platform. So I think this spirit of progress through the adoption of new technologies such as the printing press must continue. In fact, it's continuing. There's an effort here to digitize Kampong Gelam, so to speak. But I think in the end, much as I'm an ardent supporter of digitalization, I think we cannot take away the physical interaction, because I think at the end of the day, that's what brings communities together. We can share each other's literature, but it's when we sit down at the same table and share each other's foods and rich culture that we become closer. So Arun, I thank you for suggesting this wonderful idea. I thank the Malay Heritage Center for being a kind host, and of course Budhi for coming together with our partners from the Tamil Society to sort of bring this event together. I must say that I will end here by the fact that as a person from both worlds, I have one foot in one community and one foot in the other community, because my father is of Indian heritage, my mother is Malay. And I recall hearing Tamil being spoken among my uncles. I never knew what they were talking about. But that shows how close you are in terms of the worlds that surround you, basically. And we like to believe that in one way or the other, it has enriched us and enriched our families and our community. So thank you very much, and thank you very much to the organizers for a wonderful event. Thank you.
Thank you. In bringing this event to a close, please allow me to just say one personal word. I'm a Tamil Singaporean, born and bred here, and quite familiar with Tamil history, or at least I thought. Yet, I had no idea that the Tamil Muslim community, which spearheaded Tamil publishing nearly 200 years ago in this country, was also a pioneer in Malay publishing. What an extraordinary tale of coexistence and collaboration. It seems to me that this is exactly what Singaporeans, especially young Singaporeans, need to know. That different, even divergent communities could come together and work for a common cause. Now, as we bring this event to a close, we will be showing you a QR code that we'd like you to scan to provide some feedback about the event. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to whip up your phones wherever you are to scan this QR code and provide us with your feedback. Okay, on behalf of the Malay Heritage Center, Budhi, and the Center for Singapore Tamil Culture, CSTC, I thank all of you for taking the time and trouble to spend this precious afternoon with us. We very much hope to see you again. Thank you and goodbye.